Hello and welcome to you all. I'm Jacqueline Sundberg and I work with the ROAAr group here at the McGill Library. I really am delighted to welcome you all to our first event of the semester with Professor Nik Luka, Montreal's Built Environment, Planning, Design, Sustainability, and Social Equity. This is the first in our new and newsworthy series. Guest speakers from Montreal and beyond give us headlines about what is new at ROAAr and what is newsworthy in research fueled by the ROAAr collections. We are pleased to say that this event, in keeping with the spirit of sustainability that we will hear about today, has been awarded a virtual sustainable event certification by the McGill Sustainable Events Program, run by the Office of Sustainability.
Next up, order of events. Before we go further though, I do want to take a short minute and think about where I'm tuning in from. Even though many of us are likely tuning in from our home offices or wherever it is you find yourself today, we're tied to particular places and we're part of the environments that we live in. Today's talk explores the built places of Montreal, and the downtown campus of McGill, where I am today, is situated on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. And this site has long served as a place of meeting and exchange of ideas. We recognize and respect those nations as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters that McGill stands on today. It really is a privilege to be able to continue the tradition of exchanging ideas, even more so when we have digital events like this one that let us bring together voices and ideas from so many different places. So today we'll be hearing from Professor Nik Luka, and to introduce him, I'm going to pass the baton to my colleague, David Greene, who's the liaison librarian for the Schools of Architecture and Urban Planning here at McGill. And later on, we'll be hearing from my other colleague, Jennifer Garland, who's the assistant head of rare books and special collections, and also a liaison librarian and subject librarian for some specific architectural holdings that they'll tell us about a little bit later on. So over to you, David.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you today Professor Nik Luka. So Professor Luka is joint appointed between McGill Schools of Architecture and Urban Planning, and is currently serving as the interim director of Montreal's Interdisciplinary Research Center. Professor Luka describes himself as a specialist in ethnography, landscape studies, and critical studies of design and planning, with a particular interest in what he calls re-urbanism, or the processes of transformation, contestation, and negotiation that occur in re-urbanizing landscapes. He's a passionate researcher and teacher, as well as an eloquent speaker and writer who we are very fortunate and grateful to have as a guest lecturer here today. And with that, I hand it over to Professor Luka to present his talk, Montreal's Built Environment, Planning, Design, Sustainability, and Social Equity. Over to you, Nik.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you everyone at the ROAAR team and at the library for inviting me today. I hope you can see my slide on your display. It looks like it's all in order, so that's excellent. It's really a pleasure to be able to participate and to share with you some thoughts and reflections on well-being in Montreal's built environment. And I'm speaking about that as a topic that has been sustaining preoccupation for planning as a profession and as a disciplinary endeavor that really emerged in the early 20th century in Canada, as in many other English-speaking countries in the formal sense. But of course, we've done planning since the beginning of human settlements in various ways. So it's a fuzzy profession. And architecture is similarly clearly defined in certain ways, but has broad preoccupations. So the talk I'm giving today is one that exploits to some extent, but not in the fulsome sense, because there's so much exciting material. Explores is maybe a better word, the exciting range of material that we have in the collections at McGill. And I'm going to give you sort of a little bouchée here and there of some interesting tidbits that we have that I've been starting to explore as part of a larger project, which has to do with what I call welfare landscapes, particularly in the post-war years in OECD countries. The title that you see here on this front slide is a slightly longer one than the version that was disseminated. I wanted to introduce a couple of nuances. In particular, I want to draw your attention to the idea of urban design and landscape planning, both of which are interdisciplinary sorts of endeavors. They aren't fully formed professions. There aren't schools of urban design or schools of landscape planning by and large, but they are the important ways in which specialists who are trained in architecture, planning, geography, law, social work, etc., come together and try to concert or collaborate on efforts to make the world better, or to at least make the world less bad for a wide range of people, and of course to ensure the sustainability of the human species on Earth, which is a very major question at this point in the climate emergency, etc. So I'm giving you a few historical perspectives, but as was so nicely stated in the kind introduction that I was given, I'm not an historian. I consider myself more an ethnographer and someone who teaches in two professional schools and who has training in architecture and planning as professional domains. So that's by way of a sort of a disclaimer. The preoccupations are, of course, sustainability, social justice, which is to say that we want to ensure that conditions for the pursuit of human happiness are shared in some equitable manner, but also in ways that allow for our continued flourishing on Earth. And those are obviously not easy things to accomplish. So I want to give you a bit of background before I plunge into the material on who I am and what it is that I do. So I'm all academics are a bit narcissistic, so I'm going to ask you to indulge me a little bit by telling you a bit about some of the work that I've done. I do quite a bit on what are called cultural landscapes, physical landscapes that have been reshaped and defined by human activity, usually the work of groups, maybe not in self-conscious ways, and often not through the work of professional interveners such as architects, planners, engineers, and so on and so forth. And also quite a bit on housing, the physical morphologies of our human settlements, but all linked together by the idea of social practice, the way that people use space, the way that people construct meaning in space. And that's where I'm sort of hanging my hat when I say that I consider myself primarily an ethnographer. These are just some of the pieces I've done in the past. And there's quite a bit of work here that has to do with second homes, peri-urban space, suburban landscapes, places where people live, the spaces of reproduction, as sometimes they're called in more interpretive ways. But in particular, the everyday spaces in which social practice and norms get shared, communicated, challenged, transformed, and developed, etc. So I'm very interested in how people construct place and how then place constructs people and our understandings of the world around us and the possibilities for our interactions. And that, of course, can be endlessly fascinating in happy and pleasant ways, but it's also very sobering because we start to see some of the ways in which the built environment actually becomes a vector or an apparatus to perpetuate social division, to perpetuate things like structural racism, the sorts of things that we're all grappling with, or hopefully all starting to grapple with nowadays with Truth and Reconciliation, and in the moment of especially at McGill, thinking about anti-Black racism. These are the sorts of things I really find fascinating as images and scenes. You know, the way that on the right, a gentleman in a small town in French Flanders has transformed the facade of his house with plastic and real plants as an expression of what he sees as valuable and what he sees as a contribution to the public realm of the city. The obvious sorts of material enduring elements such as housing and houses that get put into landscapes in very particular ways, both as expressions of status, but also as pure sorts of mechanisms or devices for enjoying space. And of course, there's a lot of interesting stuff that we can see in terms of, on the image on the left, how public art can play a really interesting role in helping us to make sense of the world around us and what we do. This is a whimsical piece that was part of a sort of a community-based design event that I helped to organize in the Mile End about 12 years ago. And here we have what one of my students said, that must be a Montreal picture because that's a Montreal hipster dad pushing that kid through the pram. And yes, that is true. All of that is true. But just that classification, of course, was also an interesting expression of the idea of a cultural landscape as being both the physical artifacts that are not human, and of course, ourselves as humans, as embodied entities. I'm very interested in the way that people appropriate space and make claims on space that can have impacts on ecological processes, on biodiversity, and on opportunities for the way that land gets used. What you see in this scene is what are often called exurban settlement patterns, which is to say they're not suburban in a conventional understanding of terms. They're farther away from population centers, but not too far. They are situated in places that have got certain kinds of visual or aesthetic qualities. Often that's the sort of farmland countryside scenes that seem to have a particular fascination in Anglo-American culture. In this case, right on the shores of a lake. They're often very large houses on very large parcels of land, and they're often very much McMansions, and that's actually a technical term that's used in architecture and urban design. They're supersized houses that are deliberately ostentatious. And of course, by virtue of claiming land that could be used for agricultural production and transforming it for decorative lawns and so on and so forth, they're also changing the way that land can be used for the many in the interests of how land can be used for the few. I'm interested in transformations. This is a double exposed picture from a Nikon FM2 camera that I had where the film advance lever didn't work that well. And it accidentally double exposed a residential street in Toronto with a commercial street or a mixed use main street in Toronto. But it captures beautifully the idea that places change over time. And we forget that. And that's why there are lots of contestations and arguments that take place. So I'm very interested in the kinds of arguments and disruptions that take place, as well as just the ways in which built form and activities accrue and layer up over time. I don't limit myself to sort of the conventional spaces that architects and planners focus on in many contexts, academically speaking. I'm really fascinated by suburban landscapes and by things like parking lots as spaces of sociability, as we see here, spaces of appropriation by independent merchants, first generation Canadians in this example here. And of course, on the complicated work of rebuilding and maintaining our public works and our infrastructure. This is from a photo collection called Shorpy, which if you've never discovered it is great fun, hours of good stuff. So very quickly, I do some work on critical perspectives on the professional work of helping people to produce built environments, but also when architects, planners, engineers, elected officials are nominated or somehow given the responsibility of shaping the physical environment. So I'm very interested in how professional norms intersect with social practice and everyday values. And a lot of the work I'm doing right now, as you see in the second or the upper right-hand side, the phenomenon of densification, which is both controversial, but also something that we're scratching our heads about now because of vector-borne diseases, most obviously COVID-19, sort of making us rethink the idea of proximity and certainly changing our comfort thresholds in terms of how close we are to one another. And I'm talking about that specifically because that's really important to the specific ideas and archival materials I'm going to share with you. So I'm not going to talk too much about these pieces other than to say a lot of the work I've done through collaboration with colleagues in law, political philosophy, and other fields has been around what we often call community planning or community-based design, where we try to figure out ways in which we can empower and enable non-specialists or non-experts, so to speak, but those are problematic terms, to actually have agency and opportunities for having voice in shaping their everyday environments. And the little images you see on the right-hand side of the slide here are two examples of walking the land and doing community workshops with post-it notes with people whom we call in French, Monsieur, Madame, tout le monde, people who don't have a whole bunch of credentials necessarily after their name and don't therefore come to the conversation with a particular kind of formal expertise, because they are actually experts in terms of how places work and what their meanings, what the meanings are and the values are that they associate with them. Not that those meanings and values are necessarily always that scalable or sustainable. So this is the kind of stuff that's really fascinating, right? And Montreal is a fantastic and wonderful place to be doing this because we have a long history of civic engagement and active participation in city governance, if only because there's also a long history of very heavy-handed, top-down transformative work that's been done. I've mentioned this briefly. This is just a nice little passage. I'm really not trying to frame my talk in any formal way with theoretical or scholarly articulations of ideas, because I think that the fun stuff is actually in the material evidence, the archival material that helps us to talk about ideas of sustainability and justice. But I really like what Billy Fleming at Penn has said here in a piece called Design and the New Green Deal. Architects, landscape architects, planners, professionals work on discrete sites with incrementalist tools, small tools that we can make small changes with. But we all recognize that we work within larger institutional structures that tend to produce, or at the very least perpetuate, systems or vectors of injustice and unsustainability. And so a lot of the work that's going on right now in my fields, in my neck of the woods, so to speak, is critical reflections on our own capacities and possibilities and assumptions in design, so that we can actually live up to the tall expectations or the great ambitions that we often have in terms of transforming the world for the better. So I've also done quite a few pieces that are what I call provocations, as well as reflections on professional practice, etc., going back 20 years. And a lot of that work has been, as you see, almost all of my work is with other people. I do very collaborative work. I rarely fly solo, as it were, because I think it's in the conversations that we get the most interesting sorts of opportunities to articulate questions and come up with responses that could work. So I end here with the last sort of narcissistic moment here in terms of the return of the welfare landscape, a piece that I did for a unit at McGill where I'm an associate member, called the Institute for Health and Social Policy, on the return of the welfare landscape in times of COVID. The recognition that we seem to have had that a lot of the things that are going to ensure our continued happiness as a species are things that can only be done through collective action, and where the state may have to play particular roles, and we have to make trade-offs in terms of our personal comfort or our own individual interests for the common good, for the public good. And that's a general preoccupation that I have nowadays in terms of research. I was going to talk quite a bit about some of my work, but I think you're probably bored of hearing about what I do and so on. You want to see the sort of the substance and content. The specific things I've been playing with in terms of the collections at McGill are part of a larger project that's based in Sweden, and it's called the Welfare Landscape Reassembled: Policies for Sustainable Outdoor Recreation in Times of Urban Densification. Strange combination of ideas, you might say, but that's what academics are specialists at, right? Putting together ideas in unexpected ways in the hopes of generating useful insights. And what we're specifically interested in here in this project is the way that in the last 20 years or so, there's been an enormous rethinking of work that was done in the post-war years in countries like Sweden and Canada, where the state played a strong role in reshaping the built and physical environment with a view to sort of improving chances for human happiness, health, well-being, hopefully in the interests of redistributive justice, etc. And are in many cases actually rejecting very important things that were done and physically inscribed in our everyday landscapes in favor of new, more fashionable ideas that seem to make sense. And of course, this is fundamental in a way to the human condition, right? We like to reject what we did 1 or 2 generations ago just because it was done 1 or 2 generations ago. So I'm very fortunate in having, under the leadership of a colleague in Sweden, Mattias Kviström, with whom I've been working very closely for about 12 years, quite a bit of funding to explore these ideas. And I want to tell you in pictures what I mean by our basic argument. This is an example of a Swedish post-war suburban town. It's called Gottsunda. It's about 40 kilometers, 50 kilometers north of Stockholm. And what you see here is mainly housing, but you can also see that there's a large parking lot, there's a shopping center, there's schools, there are institutions. This is a classic example of a very carefully planned and carefully laid out landscape that was, the terms of which, in a sense, were dictated by professional expertise, ensuring that people would live always within a 5-minute walk of a patch of forest where they could walk and collect berries, because that's integral to Swedish identity, right? Walking through the forest in the summer is something that is not just about enjoying nature, so to speak, but also about contributing in a way to the household economy by collecting berries and mushrooms, etc. What you see here is a lot of green space, a lot of open space, but if you look closely, a lot of footpaths, narrow little walkways or bikeways that connect everything together. And what's really fascinating here, and what's been going on in Sweden through central government initiatives in the last 10 years, is a rejection of these ideas and a transformation of them because there are new ideas that seem to make more sense in terms of sustainability, energy budgets, in terms of social well-being, happiness, and so on and so forth. And our emphasis on outdoor recreation is that our basic argument is that opportunities for passive use of outdoor space for exercise are actually being truncated and lost through current transformations of older suburban landscapes. This is stuff that's getting some attention in scholarly circles. Okay, so this is a piece that Matthias and one of our postdocs published just earlier this year. And the argument is that although the welfare landscape came to fruition, and very clearly in Nordic countries such as Sweden, where the welfare state was very strong, it remained a bit of a patchwork. And we need to go back into history and look back at archival documents and look back at the discourses that were being constructed and sustained to understand what the intentionalities were, what the people who were planning and designing and commissioning the configurations of the built environment were expecting, or at least hoping for. Because those intentions tend to endure once they get physically inscribed in the built environment. The physical environment tends to have a lot of inertia. It's hard to transform things without spending a lot of money, or certainly without spending a lot of energy in direct or in terms of embedded energy terms. This is something that is being talked about in Canada. A deceased specialist on social justice, Glenda Laws, did some work about 25 years ago on the idea of Toronto's welfare state and its built form. So, okay, here we go. Now we're understanding some of the things that I'm talking about. It's being talked about in Canada. Here are the diagrams that she included. This is Toronto, if you don't recognize the peculiar shape. And these are 4 or 5 studies that she did on particular social service nodes or institutions that we consider part of the Canadian welfare state: group homes, hospitals, children, garderie, daycare centers, housing for the seniors, housing for the aged. These are dots on maps. This is a Cartesian representation of the built environment of the welfare state. I know it's small, so I'm zooming in on one of them. This is where group homes were located. You might look at this. Maybe some of you have got expertise in map reading, in planning, and so on and so forth. Many of you probably don't. You say it looks like a bunch of dots on a map. Is something missing? Did something get screwed up in the printing? I don't know that this tells us too terribly much, this particular diagram. So my argument, and the argument of people like my colleagues, Matthias Kristrom, and the other folks with whom I'm working, is that we have to extrude these analyses into 3 and 4 and multiple dimensions of time and space, so that we can understand what we actually might see when we talk about the manifestations of welfare statism in the physical environment. And so here's an example of what we're particularly interested in as a problem, as an issue. This is another part of one of our study areas. It's in the city of Uppsala, of which Gottsunda, that place I just showed you, is basically a suburb. And what we see here is early suburban welfare statist housing in this sort of zigzaggy complex with green space in between. And then we see 1960s and 1970s constructions with these what look like little boxes that have been set in the green landscape, and then these rows of townhouses, etc. But right in the middle, look at where the sushi place is. This is new stuff that's being built right now. And this is actually the transformation, the physical transformation and the rejection of the organizational principles on which these older landscapes were based. And so what's happening is, quite literally, green space is being eradicated along major streets and in the nooks and crannies around people's everyday built environments to provide more buildings, to provide more housing. Because one of the current grand preoccupations in urban design and landscape planning is the idea of compact urban form, that we need to compress everything and put housing and jobs really close together and get rid of open space, and get rid in particular of this useless open space, that stupid lawn that nobody uses, those trees that people look at but don't really care about, right? Now, I think you're probably getting a sense of where I'm going with this argument, right? I'm being deliberately provocative because this is something as a state-led intervention. in which the private sector, land developers, of course, are licking their lips because they're saying, look at all of that potential for profit and for transformation, and in which, of course, the everyday practitioner of planning and architecture will find himself, herself bound up and not necessarily able to challenge. And one of the things that's going on here then is that a different kind of plausibility is being put forward in terms of why this is an appropriate response to the need for new housing and or for the provision of affordable housing. And I say that, I think I saw on the list of participants here, one of my mentors, Beth Milroy, who taught me and did some excellent work on the idea of how we articulate and construct plausibility as a fundamental task in the work of planning and design. We try to make arguments that are convincing to others. In this case, what's going on in Sweden, and to some extent in Canadian contexts, we are constructing plausibility for ripping out green space and taking away pedestrian connections that are open to the public. As you see here, here's a pedestrian pathway that actually goes underneath the road and links up. These are being replaced by very privatized spaces of courtyards where only a handful of people will feel comfortable circulating, etc. And this is something that planners and designers have been doing for decades, if not for centuries, right? I'm going to jump over to Hamburg in Germany, where in many ways the idea of the welfare state was born. Not Hamburg necessarily, but if there are some European history, governance history folks in the room, you might correct me on this, but Bismarck's Prussia is where the origins of many of the things that we take for granted in the contemporary welfare state, in terms of unemployment insurance, in terms of social security measures for families, etc., were first introduced. And what also happened in northern Germany in terms of the origins of what we call modern city planning, in many ways, was the clearing out of crowded, dirty neighborhoods where there were problems with public health. And these activities, these big events, often happened after major waves of vector-borne diseases swept through. Cholera is a notable one. Spanish flu is another one. Tuberculosis had a tremendous impact. And of course, these are conversations that we're having now in Canada and across the world in terms of COVID-19. What do we do to ensure that people are not jeopardized in terms of going about their daily routines? And I am also referring to Hamburg here because the very word that is used to describe this part of the city, where you see, if you're an architectural historian, you may recognize the building on the right. It's called the Chile House, an architect called Fritz Herger, built in 1923. It was basically what we would have called in the 1950s in Canada, slum clearance, the eradication of the neighborhood that you see photographed in the top left, which was closed, lots of narrow streets, lots of small spaces, lots of people, lots of activities compressed in space, and the clearing out in the interest of health. So this area is called the Sanierungsviertel, which officially is translated as redevelopment district, but can quite literally be understood as the health cleansing district, or the neighborhood that we cleaned out and hosed down and demolished and rebuilt with more open and airy spaces, etc. This happened in Montreal. It happened in other parts of Canada. This is the Habitation Jean Mance, which is between Ontario and just behind St. Catherine, just east of Saint Laurent. It was one of the first major social housing projects that was undertaken in Canada, and it involved the clearance of a whole series of small scale buildings, tightly woven blocks, public spaces, and so on, because they were considered to be taudis. They were considered to be decrepit, unrepairable, and they required the heavy hand of government to come in. And this is what we often associate with the welfare state. Of course, this was something that architects and planners jumped on, and it was also part of a movement that is very simply defined by Robert Fishman, and I think in an elegant way, as the shift from the open to the enclosed, which we're now seeing, which follows the shift from the enclosed to the open. So small, close streets of the sort that we saw here, of the sort that we saw in the old neighborhoods of Hamburg. This is the enclosed that built up over centuries in many human settlements. It was deliberately rejected and replaced by open configurations with lots of green space, with lots of distance between buildings. The idea, of course, was quite literally to aerate the everyday environment, etc. This was done very deliberately in Montreal. There were studies that were done. These are archival photographs that the city holds, which are documentation of the houses that were being expropriated for the construction of some of these large projects, including the social housing complex known as Habitation Jean Mance. And this little diagram is from André Lortie. It's a map of several of the grands projets that were undertaken in the 50s and the 60s and right through the 70s with the Olympic Stadium in Montreal, which were very much the actions of what we could call the welfare state, not necessarily with the interest of redistributive justice, but with the interest of creating what many scholars have called citizen subjects, who would pay attention to what the rules were and what the norms were, be good workers, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of interesting documentation we can examine in terms of this, but I want to jump through to where the McGill archives become really interesting to me. And I promise I'm only going to talk for about another 7 minutes. Okay, so if any of my hosts are starting to bite their fingernails, please don't. A project that I'm working on right now in a very specific way as part of the larger conversation engendered by this, this examination, exploration of the welfare landscape, as where is it that we find the green geographies of Canada's furtive welfare landscapes? And I say furtive quite deliberately because they were here and there, they were occasional, they were not necessarily well done or comprehensively done. And as such, they're often being rejected or in a sense obliterated in contemporary reurbanization work where reconstruction is taking place. And I don't know that we're making just progress in the sense of progress that improves justice, or that we're just muddling through, even though ostensibly that's certainly what public sector planning is aiming to do. Often it's thought of as ensuring employment and economic development and maintaining the property tax base, but it also has a very important social role to ensure some role of some level of social equity and so on and so forth. And this is a specific piece that I'm working on with Desiree Valadares, who's finishing her PhD at Berkeley. She did an MArch degree with us a few years ago at the School of Architecture at McGill. So the work we're doing is trying to find the green geographies of Canadian welfare landscapes as part of a larger conversation and a special issue of a journal that is forthcoming in 22. A core question is, how is landscape as a system of physical artifacts and infrastructures and norms actually being used in our approaches in Canada since the mid-20th century to create landscapes that support particular ways of life? Okay, and our argument is that it's tentative, occasional, furtive, as I've mentioned, inconsistent, and equivocal. Equivocal in the sense of 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Maybe we'll try this, and then we'll not continue with it, and so on. What we seem to find so far is an absence of clear regimes or periodicity. So I don't have a clear typology for you, or a very coherent narrative necessarily. But I do have a specific set of claims that I'm very happy to hear feedback on if anyone is interested or especially has expertise that I certainly don't have because I'm not an historian. Desiree and I are arguing that there were 5 material manifestations of the welfare state in Canada in the post-war years. First one is a familiar range of infrastructures that we sometimes think of as soft or hard infrastructures. Public schools, including where we are at McGill, state-funded universities. Social housing, very small in number, and really only geared to households who are really in core need, as that is officially called under Canadian policy. Healthcare provision and a range of social services. So if you think back to the maps of Toronto that I showed you, group homes, for instance, fall into this first category. It's a big category, but it's because that's where most of the scholarly work that we've found seems to be concentrated. There's a lot of discussion of social services, social security, unemployment insurance, the sort of basic labor supporting sorts of measures that were taken. Another important area in which we saw material manifestations of the welfare state is what I'm going to talk about a bit to wrap up my presentation today. Neighborhood planning, that is to say local municipal planning, which includes municipal parks and leisure facilities. Think back to the fact that Matthias and our team are really interested in recreational infrastructure as part of what comprises or contribute to social sustainability and well-being. There were the large national and provincial parks, depending on whether you're in Quebec or elsewhere in Canada. A national park may mean one that's run by Canada or one that's run by Quebec. Okay, but there was an enormous investment and setting aside of land for national and provincial parks with the intent of making landscapes accessible for sport, leisure, and enjoyment of our natural resources in Canada in the post-war years. But there was also a parallel motion, which was to privatize an enormous amount of land in the rural urban fringe, the selling off of crown land at very low prices to allow people to have second homes, cottages, chalets, and so on and so forth. And this is a very privatized landscape. One of the conversations we're having in a gentle way in Quebec now is on the privatization of waterfronts, of lakes, shores, and rivers, etc., and the difficulty that the average person has in being able to access all of these fantastic water bodies that we have. And the final category is that there were some site-specific sorts of installations, sometimes temporary, but more usually long-lasting, what we'd often call équipement, but are often thought of as civic assets. So very particular installations, of which Expo 67 in Montreal is a very important, if ephemeral, example. Okay. I'm going to skip over this. This is just part of the rationale. As I mentioned, I'm only going to talk about two. So here's what I'm going to dive into and give you a quick tour of some of the things that Jennifer Garland and David Greene have been helping me to get my hands on in terms of the collections at McGill. We have a number of things, many of which are actually from philanthropic organizations established before the First World War, notably the Montreal Parks and Playgrounds Association. Here we see the 7th annual report for the year ending November 1908. Okay, here's this is from the McGill Archives catalog, and I put the link. I'll make the slides available after the fact, so you can click through on the links. This was an organization founded in 1902 to preserve and promote parks, playgrounds, and open spaces. It then became part of a welfare federation that was a sort of a philanthropic league, and then was dissolved in 1961. And I would argue that one of the reasons that some of these organizations ceased to operate is because the state stepped in, and especially in Quebec, started playing the role that other organizations such as the churches had played, as well as philanthropic organizations. So we see some beginnings, some murmurs and some interest in how are we going to improve the welfare of the general population. This is a report from October 1912, general facts to be considered in carrying out a comprehensive recreational system for Montreal. Well, okay, good intentions, sounds exciting. 1912, before the First World War. 1912 is around about the same time that we started to see the stirrings of institutionalized planning in Canada, and what was often, we were in the moment that's often called in urban history the reform era, where there was a lot of thinking about how we need to actually create some parameters for the private sector so that the public and the common good is not being hindered. So it's fascinating just to look at what kinds of preoccupations these sorts of studies have, right? What children in Montreal are doing in their leisure hours. I don't know if we necessarily want to know what all children are doing in their leisure hours, but there's a little bit of an empirical study that was done here. Note the kind of things that are included here: public baths, billiard rooms, bowling alleys, okay? These are the kinds of infrastructures or équipements that were considered to be important and in many cases lacking for the well-being of the population. Here's a little lovely glimmer of empirical evidence, one of these nuggets that becomes so fascinating and sobering to look at. What are the facilities that we find in our public schools, the fitments? I'm not going to go through each one of these details, but what's listed here is the Protestant school board, which was typically the English-speaking school board, school system, and the Catholic school board. And one thing that's really interesting is that we have 24 schools on the Protestant side, 44 schools on the Catholic side. We have a total of 18 gymnasiums with equipment, 17 of which were in the Protestant system. But don't worry, all schools are supplied with pianos, so everyone can sing God Save the King in the same key. So here's an interesting first diagnostic, a sort of snapshot of how there is social disparity in terms of access to particular sorts of amenities and services. And one of the concerns that is expressed here, which is really interesting, is that none of the public schools, in the opinions of the authors of this study, have undertaken any outside work in physical training, public entertainment, school athletic leagues, etc. Many of you will know that the First World War was a wake-up call in many countries, especially in Great Britain, because the men in particular who reported for service on the front lines as soldiers were found to be in such terrible physical condition that a great priority was made in Britain and other countries on improving the quality of everyday living environments, housing, and community planning after the First World War. Another interesting example, I'm jumping ahead to the Second World War, is the rethinking of the physical landscape in terms of values and norms. Instead of having decorative front lawns and flower beds during the Second World War, there was a tremendous push to plant a victory garden, right? To help to relieve the pressure on the food system for the theaters of war by creating greater self-sufficiency in terms of households. This is fascinating stuff. Of course, you see these lovely spreads from the newspapers, victory garden competition, prizes and honors, incentives, etc. Of course, there were winners. There was a beautiful plaque that you could, I suppose, put up onto your wall. Here's the winner of the first annual contest in 1943, Mr. Tappenden, who lived in an apartment and was doing his victory garden in a vacant parcel of land. And they were invited to a nice dinner. Of course, one of the other things you start to discover when you rummage through the archives is things like, well, the victory garden is for households and families, but the prize winners are, of course, the men, right? So the ticket here admitting somebody to the dinner is for the prize winners and their wives, although ironically it admits a woman. So interesting little things around how gendered so much of these sort of coordinated efforts were, and that's not surprising. Part of the fun of doing archival work is seeing these really charming little documents, right? The cute little promotional material that was part of building up a buzz or building up excitement. And of course, since it's food, I couldn't resist looking at what was actually on the menu. Notwithstanding the little image that shows vitamins and tasty fresh food, what you see in this menu, this fixed menu, is one of the most depressing meals I've ever seen. Broiled chicken, potatoes, carrots, peas, and what's probably just a chocolate cake, renamed with some kind of victory term. And obviously the typesetters didn't have any accents on their characters, bûche glacée de la victoire, etc. So funny little paradoxical things. Comic relief aside, and this is where I'll sort of bring myself to a close, is that one of the speeches made at one of these events really pointed to the need for concerted effort and interventions. And I'll blow up what this particular line is. Without civil approval, no definite plans can be made. We can only hope that the city authorities will incorporate into their park system the establishment of permanent garden sites. That was done to an extent, but it took decades, okay? And in the other realms in which neighborhood community planning and the production of the welfare state as a system of support for the general population was through green papers and white papers. I had a great joy of stumbling upon an original copy of a set of lectures on housing and community planning at McGill University School of Architecture, 1943 to 1944, following hot on the heels of the Marsh Report, 1943, which was considered the blueprint for the post-war Canadian welfare state. And basically what this collection of talks and papers put forward as an argument is that we cannot stop at social security, et cetera. We have to make sure that we are engaging in investments and concerted efforts around the physical plan and the physical layouts of neighborhoods and infrastructure for human well-being. I'll just quickly flip through the other category that I wanted to highlight, which is ephemeral and permanent sorts of équipement or civic assets, Expo 67. Of course, there are enormous amounts of material that we have at the McGill libraries in terms of Expo 67. We also have some really interesting things around piggybacking new investments on particular infrastructure projects, such as the construction of Mirabel Airport. And one important story that doesn't often get told when we think back to the story of Mirabel is that there was a very strong argument to connect the airport to the city, not just with expressways, but with public transport, and to create a high-speed rail link. And so we have some documents that have to do with the REM, the original REM. Of course, here we are. This is 1976, this document that I'm showing the fiche for on the left. And here we are in 2021, only just finishing up the REM system. So this is one of the stories that we have to tell in terms of planning, lovely images, etc. Another project, the last one I want to mention, is Project Archipel, which was a whole system of engaging Montrealers with the water, because we are an archipelago, right? We are an archipelago of islands, at the juncture of several rivers. And you see lots of documents, and unfortunately, Archipel is one of these projects that went straight from the drawing board to the archives because of political regime change, or so it might seem. When you look at the CMM, the Metropolitan Government's website now, you see a very clear project which has the same name. It's called the Plan Archipel. How are we going to enhance access to the landscapes, the natural milieu, and water resources in the region, because they're attractiveness factors that the CMM recognizes and wants to improve and enhance, and so on. So here we have, decades later, a plan that has reappeared. And that goes back to the basic argument, or the final point I want to make, which is that planning casts very long shadows. And welfare landscapes are examples of the very long shadows that are cast. And I think this is one of the really important reasons that our friends in the library are important to the development of plans, projects, and programs for the future, because we forget very easily what we tried to do in the past, and yet we are stuck in many ways with whatever was decided and implemented, even if only in partial ways. Things tend to come around, even if it takes decades. So I'll end there. Thank you so much.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that very amazing presentation, Nick. I was very intrigued. I'm going to share my screen. Now that we're wrapping that up, where is this? We just wanted to, my colleague Jennifer Garland and I just wanted to say a few words about our library collection as well. So I'll start by saying a couple of words about the Blackadder Lauderman collection, which is the circulating collection that supports the School of Urban Planning, as well as School of Architecture and the Department of Art History and Communication Studies. So this is the physical collection that supports the schools and department. Of course, it's also supplemented by the vast and growing digital collection as well. And you can see here it's in a beautiful space on the third floor of the Red Path Library building, which is in the Humanities and Social Sciences Library complex. So Blackadder Lauderman was established based on endowments by the family of Gordon Home Blackadder in the 1920s, who is a graduate of the School of Architecture and who died tragically in the First World War, and then by the family of Dinah Lauderman, the Montreal sculptor in the 1940s. And among the collection's strengths are its particular focus on Canadian architecture and urban planning. Recently, the Urban Plans collection used to be in the circulating collection, but has recently been ingested into our rare and special collections. But I wanted to say a word about this as well. As a very interesting collection. It includes a large number of reports and plans for urban and rural areas from all across Canada and around the world, in fact, from the 50s to the present day. So we received this collection in 2001 from the School of Urban Planning, and it was actually put together and collected over a long period of time as actually materials for pedagogical support, primarily by Professor Jean Wolfe, who was director of the school, a former director of the school, and appointee of the Order of Canada. So the value of this collection is that it serves as an historic record of the shaping of urban and rural landscapes in Canada and some cities in the United States and around the world as well. So I'll also introduce Jennifer Garland, who is the the assistant head of rare books and special collections here at the library, and is also the steward of our Canadian architecture collection and related materials. She's going to talk about a couple of special collections as well.
Thanks, David. It's interesting, since we brought the Urban Plans collection over to Rare Books and added them to our public-facing archival collections catalog, to see just how often this collection is accessed. It's fantastic. There's a broad audience for this material. If you'd flip over to the next slide, another collection that I wanted to highlight, in addition to what Nick has already mentioned, is the John Bland collection. John Bland, past director of the School of Architecture, trained as an architect and planner himself, is one of the 100 collections that we have related to McGill, Montreal, and global architecture and landscape planning. David, if you would flip the slide, we've just got some behind the scenes shots of our collections. I'm going to provide links to all of this material for our audience so you can explore more fully. The next slide looks at the collection of Harold Spence sales, and this is new to the library. We brought it in about 5 years ago. It took us that time to process and describe the collection. Harold Spence Sales, architect and planner, also established the first school of urban planning in Canada, and that is indeed at McGill University. So lots to explore here. In fact, there's too much to tell you about now in the time remaining. So we just wanted to stress that all of our ROAAr collections are available for teaching and research, but we also like to say they're here to satisfy not only your research, but your curiosity. And I like what Nik said at the start of the talk, where his research is sometimes in pursuit of human happiness. And I like to think that our ROAAr collections are here to support that as well. So let's go back to Nik. We have time for a few Q&As.
Thanks, Jennifer. We have one question that came in the chat that I think is particularly interesting. This comes in from Christopher Lyons, who's the head librarian of Rare Books and Special Collections. So he asked about your discussion of the densification of cities, such as the public housing estates. You seem to depict that the redevelopment of green space is largely in negative terms. How do you reconcile that with the criticism made by inhabitants of what was seen as the sterile environment, e.g. the common post-war towers in the park, social projects in the US, or indeed the tedium of endless suburban neighborhoods? Doesn't re-densification provide the opportunity for greater human and physical diversity, and hopefully more plentiful and hence more affordable housing?
That's a super question. And yes, I completely agree. But of course, the depth of the devil's in the details, let's say, or the devil's in the implementation. And the reason that there's a conversation taking place, and of which I'm part in the mea culpa sense, saying, hold on with all this densification, is that because we've taken away a lot of the checks and balances that were introduced in post-war neighborhood planning, problematic though they may have been, what we're ending up with is hyper-densification. And we're ending up with almost no public space and very little green space. And the green space that exists, or the open space that exists, is both private and also very marginal in many other ways. And so Griffintown is the case in point that we have in Montreal. If you take a stroll around Griffintown, where it is the fruition or the expression of a full city policy to repopulate places that are closer to services, jobs, and so on and so forth. All excellent, right? Making better use out of sunk capital, metro lines, the new REM, and enabling people to live in principle without a car, for instance. All very good. And there's no question that there was a really well-articulated critique of the very sterile post-war neighborhoods. One of the things that we find when we start drilling down through some of the archival material is that, of course, projects were only half implemented and what got criticized were typically the projects or the endeavors. When I say project, I mean in the most generic and non-pejorative sense, right? A project is any construction undertaken that involves private, public sector, et cetera. The towers in the park, the green space that was confused, and so on and so forth. Yes, problematic, but we're also rejecting the green space that is well used and well loved. So one of my PhD students, Giacomo Valsania, is currently doing his PhD work on the densification of tower neighborhoods in suburban Toronto, where allotment gardens that have been very successful, both as social spaces and as places for improving household economies for vulnerable populations, are being literally ripped out in the interest of more townhouse and condo development. So the problem is that, yes, densification, but as the most recent piece I've done is entitled, it's not how dense we make it, it's how we make it dense. that matters. And the risk is that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. So my answer is quite so. Just for a little bit of meat on the bone there in terms of published work, there's a lively debate that was really well expressed about 10 years ago by most I think capably by Jane Jacobs and Loretta Lees, called Defensible Space on the Move, Revisiting the Urban Geography of Alice Coleman. And this is actually questioning the critique and the uptake of the dismissal of post-war modernism. What in Sweden, it's not as well articulated in Canada. In Sweden, quite literally, the state debate or the state policies say all of those orchards are stupid and useless. People don't need to go into the forest. And that's one of the reasons we're looking at recreational mobilities. What is it that people are doing, and how is that part of their quality of life on a day-to-day basis? Since we have this push to public health, COVID has re-emphasized that. Public space has been totally rethought, both in terms of everyday users and in terms of how we govern and manage it, because of the different ways in which we have to move around on a daily basis for jobs. And here I'm just tipping my hat to Jacqueline, your own comments about the appreciation for a 5-minute walk to foraging space.
In fact, I actually live on the edge of Griffintown, and there is actually a remarkable lack of green space now. The new plans and the new structures that go up are remarkable in their number and in the fact that there's little green footprint aside from the canal green highway, really. But I have to interrupt and take this minute to say some thank yous because we have hit 1 p.m. and I am sorry we don't have more time for questions. I'll say a few thank yous, and if we have time to stay a little longer, we can talk through a few more of the questions. But first, thank you, Nick, for your presentation. Thank you so much, David and Jennifer, for putting some of our collections on display and giving all of us new ways to explore the archival holdings here. If you are interested in consulting material, we invite you. We have new policies on our reading room, and I'll put up a slide. You can check those out. You can send us an email at rarebooks.library@mcgill.ca if you want to book an appointment to come in to look at any of this material or to start a conversation with David or Jennifer about what's in our collections. We do have an upcoming event on the 29th. That's our next event. So thank you all for coming to this one. Our events are supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and also by private donors who make these public events possible. So thank you to Ron Harvey and Doug Bagley for that. On that note, I will say thanks to you all for coming, and possibly, Nick, if you have a little bit more time, we could entertain more questions if there are people who want to continue the conversation. Is that something that you're okay with?
Yes, indeed. And I especially would like to respond quickly to the question from Thérèse Boucher, which is, I think, an excellent question and sort of counterpoint.
Sure.
Yeah. But thank you, everyone.
If you want to read the question aloud, that would be great for everyone.
I will certainly do that. So thank you for the talk, etc. Thank you for your kind words. The question: how do you explain that in Montreal's Peter McGill district, which is basically just where McGill University is, a little bit to the west, with 40,000 inhabitants, public équipements have been disappearing for the last 40 years, with nowadays no public primary school, swimming pool, equipped play gardens for kids, and so on. Thinking of Cabot Square, the former Montreal Children, and the Domtar Garden. And this is a case in point for the sort of hyper densification and the way that public amenities and green spaces tend to fall off the to-do list in the execution of these large projects, of these grands projets. And that is not something that's new. It's a point that was raised by Blanche Van Ginkel in a documentary for the National Film Board on post-war neighborhood planning in Canada, in which they pointed out the way that a lot of new suburban neighborhoods that were being built, and this goes back to the excellent comment that the question that Christopher Lyons articulated, were being built out and lacking so many of the things that made the sort of demonstration projects, so to speak, in Sweden and other places more successful. And so this is a problem that the city is very aware of. And I, in fact, just finished supervising a master's student who did his capstone project on how can we improve public space and porosity and équipement in the Peter McGill district as part of the reconstruction of St. Catherine in particular. And that was actually a commissioned piece, in a sense, a commissioned piece of research by colleagues at the Ville Centre, because I'm part of one of the commissions on the reconstruction of St. Catherine. And one of the arguments that I and many others have been making is that we have to enhance public amenities and public space, especially because so many more residents are, in principle, coming into this area. We know that there are many new households, many new residents in the new housing that's being built. We also know, unfortunately, that a lot of the new housing that's being built is being held by speculators who don't even spend time in Montreal, let alone in those dwellings. So one of the mechanisms, so I agree completely. I think this is exactly why we need to have these kinds of conversations. And we have to bring pressure to bear always, hold the feet of both the private sector and the state to the fire, is we need to ensure that there's a follow through and that we have the complete delivery of high quality environments. And so one instrument that's been very successful in the US is what's called community benefit agreements. And those are legal agreements, legal contracts that are set up when a major project, whether private or public, is undertaken. So think here of the reconstruction of the Royal Victoria Hospital, right, in which McGill is imbricated, right? And there is a set of entailments. You must provide all of these things. And if you do not provide these things, then you'll have to pay a cash penalty or you will be taken to court. And so there are mechanisms, but they have to be done upstream. And that doesn't always happen as well, right? A really
question actually
yes,
that's quite along the same lanes that from Gwendolyn Owens, talking about citizen participation and how we can actually engage citizens and educate them so that their contributions are useful and respected in these major projects. Do you want to kind of continue along those lines, keeping that citizen angle in mind?
Yes, so this is one of the great challenges, but one of the great riches and opportunities, right? And again, this is where I think Montreal is exceptional because we have what's called the Office de Consultation Publique de Montréal, which is basically a public hearings agency for any number of major projects. Now, of course, the problem is embedded in its name. It's a consultation office, right? The public is engaged as a consultant would be engaged. I will take your comments under advisement. Right, so the recommendations that are put forth by the hearings, the commissions that are organized and where deputations are heard, the recommendations are taken under advisement by the public sector, by the government. And this is not to villainize the state or the public sector, the municipal government, or anything like that. There are enormously good intentions and many, many, many good people. But we live in a world that's driven hard by politics and capital. And we see that, of course, in the midst of our federal and municipal election discussions that we're experiencing in Montreal. So citizen engagement is a great challenge, but a great opportunity. And one of the challenges is that people do want to participate and do want to have a voice, but it's very difficult to provide the space and the resources to enable everyone to have a voice or to enable a cross-section of diverse publics to have a voice. And then it becomes very difficult to maintain confidence in the fact. And when you think about the number of public hearings, recommendations are issued and summatively ignored, right? What I've seen in 15 years of doing a lot of sort of at the coalface, grassroots, community engaged work is a level of citizen fatigue that is in many ways depressing because people say, don't ask me to talk to you about what the future of this street should be. What I'm going to say is going to be ignored anyway. We took part in all of these workshops, we took part in all of these conversations, and then the politicians just decided to do what they wanted to do anyway, or the décideurs, the deciders in the sort of generic and unknown sense. So one of the great challenges for public engagement is how do we actually ensure that people feel that they are being given voice and actually have agency in processes. And I don't know that we've been very successful because a lot of public engagement processes in countries like Canada remain sort of tacked on after the fact, after the sort of afterthoughts in terms of due process. This was a set of questions I was really exploring with a colleague in law who was then poached by the University of British Columbia and now occupies a chair, but someone, Hui Kong, who's very interested in deliberative democracy and the concept, the principle of subsidiarity, and so on. So a superb question, but again, an amazing set of opportunities and challenges, but not an easy one to answer.
We have one more question. I think that'll be the last one, but it's not a small one, I'm afraid. And it's one that maybe we can continue the conversation by email or by other discussion forums. This one comes in from Teresa Trippenbach.
Yeah.
Can you explain the meaning of structural racism in relation to urban planning?
Yeah.
Specifically, I think we might have to put a smaller lens on that for the question of time. But in relation to these, perhaps specifically in relation to public consultations and structural racism in those planning processes, do you have any comments on that?
I have many comments, and I would
Right?
very hard for me. It
More
will be
than
very
our
hard for me
time
to
allows,
speak
right?
very discreet, but I will briefly say, yes, one of the great ontological problems, I would say, of planning and architecture is that because we make things that endure, we are perpetuators and enablers of structural racism, right? We embed difference in the built environment. I'm going to see if I can pull up very quickly. There's an excellent New York Times feature on how urban heat islands are one of the artifacts. So places in the city that are always hot, where we have enormous problems when there are canicules, heat waves in the summer, are also disproportionately in many American cities where we find racialized populations, right? And that's not a coincidence, because there were policies and plans that were put in place that said, we are not going to invest in certain kinds of infrastructure and amenities in these neighborhoods, and we're also going to make it impossible for racialized communities. There was very important work in redlining that was done in the US, but also in Canada. Richard Harris at McMaster has shown that redlining was done. And that's where neighborhoods that were predominantly populated by particular ethnocultural groups. So Black neighborhoods, for instance, they had red lines drawn on maps around them, and banks would refuse to issue mortgages for them. And that's something in which the state is complicit, because, of course, one of the greatest achievements, for better or for worse, of welfare statism in Canada as in the US is that in the 1940s, we introduced publicly subsidized mortgages, which accrued enormous benefits to the middle class. And we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the massive tax subsidies that have been given to middle class homeowners. But we question in many instances the investments in things like social housing. So try not to go too long on this, but structural racism in urban planning is, I think it's almost baked in the sense that planning is a colonial project. Planning is about taking land and organizing it and putting it to uses that are appropriate for people who are in power. And our legal definition of what is good use of land right now in English common law in Canada remains highest and best use. What is the highest and best use? Buildings are improvements. Okay, so the language in the law is very much a language of settler colonialism, taking, commandeering, transforming, and so on. So there's a lot of soul searching that needs to be done, and a lot of hand wringing that's taking place, and I think also a lot of transformative action that's underway. And I think that if we want to talk about structural racism, the built environment is one of the places we really have to look.
Well, I'll reiterate my thanks again to you, Nik, for such an interesting presentation and so much food for thought and so many new avenues to explore, not only through our collections, but also through all of the collaborative papers and works that you have put out. So thank you again for presenting to us today. And thank you, Jennifer, and our support team behind the scenes. Thanks as well to all of the guests for coming. And we hope to see you again later on in the semester.